How can Sinners be seen as a Southern Gothic story? And what do vampires have to do with racial inequality? The Southern Gothic is a subgenre of Gothic fiction rooted in the American South. Some scholars attribute the origin of this genre to Edgar Allan Poe and his short story, The Fall of the House of Usher. Southern Gothic stories blend haunting atmospheres, decaying settings, and grotesque characters to explore themes like social injustice, moral decay, and the legacy of slavery. Unlike traditional Gothic tales set in crumbling castles, Southern Gothic stories unfold in withered towns, haunted plantations, and broken-down homes where the real horror often lies in human behavior. Through elements of the macabre, the surreal, and the tragic, Southern Gothic stories explore the darkness beneath a Southern tradition and hospitality. Authors like William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Carson McCullers, and Anne Rice fall under this tradition. Although race is a central theme in many of these stories, the Southern Gothic is a white-dominated genre because it often deals with the effects of the Civil War on the American South. As a result, we get stories that criticize the myth of the lost cause, while at the same time portraying African American characters in a racist light. The best way I can describe many of these stories is by saying that they are complicated. For example, William Faulkner's novel suggests that he was very conflicted about his feelings toward African Americans and his loyalty to Southern ideals. I would even dare say that he struggled to reconcile his personal values with the social norms and expectations of the American South, which were rooted in white supremacy and racism. To me, this is what makes the Southern Gothic so compelling. These stories usually don't show a black and white version of reality, but a reality that is complex and therefore credible. I need to clarify that Southern Gothic novels always leave me unsatisfied because the issue of racism is never fully addressed. In fact, the theme of the curse that we usually see in Gothic stories appears in the Southern Gothic in the shape of miscegenation. It's very problematic. Nonetheless, I don't think this should prevent you from reading some of these stories because you can always discover something new about the world and about yourself. Actually, I got into African American literature thanks to reading Southern Gothic stories. To me, the most interesting elements of Southern Gothic fiction are race and African American culture. So every time I read a Southern Gothic novel, I wondered how the story would look if it was written by an African American author. The problem is that there are not many Southern Gothic stories written by African American authors. But a good example will be Toni Morrison's Beloved, a masterpiece that I love and that you should definitely read if you're interested in Southern Gothic stories and African American fiction, and if you liked Sinners. Sinners is all I ever wanted from a Southern Gothic story. The story is set in 1932 Mississippi. It begins when the twin brothers Smoke and Stack return to their hometown after serving in World War I and working for the Chicago outfit. They use money stolen from gangsters to purchase a sawmill from a racist landowner and open a juke joint for the local black community. For the opening night, they recruit their cousin Sammie, who dreams of being a blues singer and whose father is a preacher and doesn't want his son to play. Instead, he wants Sammie to follow in his footsteps. This detail will become very relevant in the story. A group of very interesting characters also joins the effort to put up the juke joint and offer entertainment. During the night, a group of vampires attacks the juke joint and horror ensues. When the story begins, there are hints that the lives of most of the characters are ruined, except for Sammie, who is still young. They are haunted by the legacy of slavery, the effects of the Civil War, and the racism that pervades the country. For example, it is emphasized that black people in Mississippi still rely on sharecropping to survive. After the American Civil War, the country entered a period of reconstruction which aimed to integrate ex-slaves into free American society. I'm using air quotes here because many white people, both from the South and the North, and even some abolitionists, were against integration. So the Reconstruction period revolved around the question of what the country should do with black people. And here is the problem. Once the slaves were free, they were also homeless. Their freedom meant they could no longer reside on the plantations. At the same time, many African Americans that had been enslaved only possessed the skills they had learned while in captivity. This translated into high rates of illiteracy and a large number of underskilled workers who needed to find employment to survive. I need to clarify that the former slaves were obviously highly skilled in plantation work because they were forced to do that for generations. However, most of them did not know life outside the slavery system. In addition, although learning skills besides those they had learned in the plantations could technically help them get more opportunities, the main reason why African Americans were not hired during this period was discrimination. So some planters took advantage of this situation and offered their ex-slaves the chance to continue living and working on the plantations in exchange for meager wages. In other words, slavery was replaced by sharecropping, a system that mimicked the exploitation of slavery. The story implies that Smoke and Stack go to Chicago after returning from the war to escape this cycle of exploitation that kept African Americans marginalized in the South. However, even in the North, they are not successful at finding fortune through honest means because they become gang members. This reminds the audience that even the participation and sacrifice of African Americans in the war did not grant Black people equal rights and opportunities in their own country. The fortune that Smoke and Stack acquire in the North also comes at a high price. They both sacrifice romantic relationships to pursue their dream of wealth. Annie, who was Smoke's wife, does not want anything to do with him because she feels his money is tainted with blood, even though they share the trauma of losing a child. Mary, Stack's ex-girlfriend, is also a tragic character. Since she has fair skin and can pass for white, Stack forces her to marry a wealthy white man to protect her from the Klan and to ensure she has a comfortable life. The characters' backstories show how the discrimination and racism they experience become determining factors in their decisions. Upon their return to Mississippi, Smoke and Stack must confront the past when they are reunited with Mary and Annie. In addition, the threat of white supremacy continues to loom over everything. By the end of the movie, it is revealed that if the vampires hadn't attacked the juke joint, the KKK would have killed everyone. One of the characters the twins recruit for the juke joint entertainment is Delta Slim. At first, Delta Slim is presented as a homeless drunk who is barely scraping by with his music on the streets. Later, we discover that he is haunted by the violence that Black men experience in the South. Delta Slim narrates how one of his musician friends was falsely accused of stealing money and assaulting a white woman. The man was lynched and his manhood was cut off. After telling the story, Delta Slim starts to hum and sing. This scene is incredibly relevant because it sets blues and music as central themes in the movie. In the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, Douglass explains that the songs of the slaves represent the sorrows of his heart, and he is relieved by them only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears. Therefore, this scene fulfills different functions. It subverts the stereotype that Black people only sing when they are happy, while reasserting that music in African American history and culture has served as an outlet for trauma and as a way to uplift the community. Following the same theme, Sammie's character arc is an allusion to the myth of blues singer Robert Johnson, who is popularly believed to have sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads in exchange for his talent. In the Palgrave Handbook of the Southern Gothic, the authors argue that the South is a region that has always been obsessed with crossroads and boundaries, whether territorial, the Mason-Dixon line, or those related to gender, social class, sexuality, and particularly race. This theme of the crossroads is essential in understanding the movie. It conveys the ability to transgress race and class boundaries, and it's underscored through different elements of the film. For example, the twins are wealthy enough to buy a sawmill from a white landowner. Their beautiful car also symbolizes their social mobility, meaning that they have transgressed the boundaries of class, thus challenging the idea that Black people are doomed to be poor. As an African American woman passing for white, Mary is also someone who can move between different worlds. The Chaws are another example. Chayton runs the store for African Americans while his wife runs the store that serves white Americans. Being of Chinese descent means that they occupy a space of in-betweenness in the segregated South. Our vampire Remick also transgresses the boundaries between life and death. However, and curiously enough, as an Irish immigrant, he could not have been seen as part of either white or Black America. As shown in the movie, Remick is discriminated against by clan members. He is seen as a white N-word. At the same time, Irish people could not find a sense of belonging within the African American community because they were white foreigners. Although in Northern Ireland, the Irish experienced de facto segregation and systemic discrimination, Irish immigrants were not free from prejudice against Black people. In many cases, both groups worked together and shared spaces within the same communities, but the Irish were eventually able to attain upward mobility. I don't want to get into too much detail here because I'm going to talk more about Remick later. Lastly, music is portrayed in the movie as having the power to transcend time, space, race, and culture. Here, the blues becomes incredibly important. In his book, Blues People, Amiri Baraka examines how ancestral African traditions and beliefs were passed down through field holders, spirituals, and work songs sung by enslaved people. The blues emerge from these songs. This means that music has been key in preserving the cultural roots of African Americans. At the same time, these songs also carry the weight of generational trauma, forced labor, and systemic oppression. So the blues not only preserves culture but also history. In this sense, the themes of the movie express how African American music has transcended geographical barriers and survived the passage of time. The blues is also related to the theme of acceptance, which becomes very relevant in the climax of the movie. In After Mecca, Women Poets and the Black Arts Movement, Cheryl Clark discusses how many blues songs center on the theme of unrequited love. She argues that this theme reflects African Americans' desire to be seen and accepted by society at large. Our identities rely on how society perceives us. If most people do not see you as a human being, then you're also going to struggle to see yourself as one. In the movie, Sammie sings a song that he has written for his father. The song expresses Sammie's feelings regarding his father's rejection of the blues. Sammie's father embodies the African American person who has internalized the idea that Black people are either good or bad. According to this belief, to be accepted into American society, Black people must be meek and subservient. I'm going to discuss this idea and Sammie's father in depth later because they are key in understanding the end of the movie. Now, let's talk about vampires. A lot of people feel like the vampire elements in the movie were a little anticlimactic, but I think that's the whole freaking point. If you love Gothic fiction as much as I do, you already know that the main horror element in these stories is usually there to highlight a greater horror. A horror that is usually hidden within the psyche of the characters or within the society in which they live. I also think that because of novels like Twilight and the Vampire Diaries, people nowadays see vampires in a different light. They think of them as ridiculous and overly romantic. However, the literary vampire is traditionally an incredibly complex figure, and I think Kugler does a good job of conveying this complexity with Remick. Vampires usually represent both the colonized and the colonizer. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole now, so I'll just say that the reason for this is that the literary vampire is associated with the Ottoman Empire and the cultures that were under its rule. They embody the figure of the other, but the other as a powerful person. For this reason, most of the time, vampires are aristocratic figures who are also bisexual, homosexual, or foreigners. In this sense, it becomes an interesting decision from Coogler to make his vampire an Irishman. Ireland was colonized by England, and since Remick is an immigrant, he would have been seen by xenophobic white Americans as an invader. The fact that the literary vampire can contaminate others by sucking their blood conveys social anxieties about sexual and cultural purity. In the context of the American South, this element is relevant due to white people's fear of miscegenation and how this was seen as a threat to their so-called racial purity. What Coogler tries to highlight through Remick is the idea of the instability of race as a fixed category. As I mentioned before, Remick might be white, but white Americans do not perceive him as such. This idea of the instability of race is also reinforced by the character of Mary. Coogler uses Mary to play with the tragic mulatto figure. In her essay, The Tragic Mulatto and Passing, Emily Clark argues that this figure, often a female character, is doomed by her racial liminality, which denies her a niche in a rigidly biracial world. This alienation asserts itself most clearly in the realm of marriage. Whether a mulatto falls in love with a white man or a black man, a happy marriage is beyond her reach. She is forbidden by law from marrying a white man and by the hierarchy of race from marrying a black. Sex, love, and marriage are almost always at the heart of the narrative variations in the genre and are often connected to a dramatic revelation that leads to tragedy. Mary looks like a white woman, but she's African American. She is actually the first African American that Remick turns into a vampire. For this reason, I think they are meant to mirror each other in some ways. This is important because the vampiric liminality, that is, the fact that vampires are stuck between life and death, can reflect both Mary and Remick's racial liminality. Coogler subverts the tragic mulatto trope by allowing Mary to actually end up with Stack. When Stack is turned into a vampire, he also starts to inhabit a liminal space where racial categories no longer matter. I think both Remick and Mary are supposed to represent the uncanny and the abject. In Gothic fiction, the uncanny refers to something that feels familiar but is actually unfamiliar, and this element is usually epitomized by the figure of the monster. Julia Kristeva examines the feelings the uncanny produces with her theory of abjection. The abject is someone or something that inhabits an ambivalent space, reminding people of what they have rejected or repressed in order to exist. So, for instance, Mary can be seen as abject because she reminds racist white people that their skin color does not reflect the so-called purity of their blood. In other words, her mere existence exposes the instability of whiteness as a racial identity. When it comes to society, the theory of abjection explains the relationship between marginalized groups and the dominant culture. Marginalized groups share the same spaces as people who are part of the dominant culture. By the same space, I mean the same country or state, but they are usually thrust aside so that the established order can be maintained. They are neither fully inside nor outside said society, and that's how they inhabit an ambivalent space. In Black Reconstruction in America, W.B. Du Bois uses his concept of the psychological wage of whiteness to explain the hierarchical relationship between African Americans and disenfranchised white Americans. Du Bois argues that poor and disenfranchised white Americans were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. This meant that although Black Americans and some white Americans were very poor and marginalized, they were still separated by a racial hierarchy that allowed white Americans to see themselves as socially superior. Being white granted marginalized white Americans access to services and social mobility that were denied to all Black people. When this racial hierarchy is threatened by people like Mary and Remick, who remind white people that race is an unstable category, the social order under which the power of white people is built is destroyed. For this reason, it's not surprising that Remick tries to convince the African American characters at the juke joint to become vampires by offering them the promise of a colorblind society. Remember that if they don't become vampires, they will be killed by the clam in the morning. This means that Remick is offering them the chance to escape racial violence through a fraud promise. Although race is indeed a social construct, to ignore racial differences at this point in history will mean disregarding how race has been used to create a hierarchical binary, positioning white as good, pure, intelligent, and human, and black as evil, depraved, unintelligent, and monstrous. At the same time, the social utopia that Remick proposes comes with the cost of dismissing the historical trauma that slavery has caused, an action that will be extremely unfair to those who were enslaved. Therefore, what Remick is offering is a false promise of integration. This idea is echoed throughout the movie through juxtaposition. For example, when the twins arrive in Mississippi and are going through their cart loaded with liquor and guns, a snake appears from within the cart, and the twins kill it. The snake dies in the same way Remick eventually does. Due to its biblical connotation, a snake can symbolize temptation, but the image here is very precise. The snake is hidden among the items the twins plan to use to start a new life. In this context, the snake symbolizes the false promise of wealth and fortune. Smoke and Stack might be successful men, but their wealth cannot save them from racism. They might possess the financial power to buy a sawmill from a racist white man, but they will still be preyed upon by the Klan the very next morning. This is a reminder that even successful Black Americans will still experience racism. There is another juxtaposition between Sammie's father and Remick right at the beginning of the movie. Like Remick, Pastor Moore is also offering Sammie a false promise by persuading him to follow in his footsteps. I think the pastor is supposed to represent historical figures like Booker T. Washington and Martin Luther King Jr. They did a lot for the Black community, but they were also criticized for yielding to white people's interests in the name of integration and for promoting ideas rooted in racial stereotypes. For instance, Du Bois criticized Washington for urging Black people to accept segregation, disenfranchisement, and second-class citizenship, at least temporarily, in exchange for economic progress through vocational training. Du Bois instead encouraged Black people to pursue higher education so they could represent African American interests in government, education, and other social institutions. Similarly, Malcolm X criticized MLK for asking Black people to turn the other cheek. This action was supposed to demonstrate to white Americans that Black people were not aggressive, an idea based on a racial stereotype. Malcolm X believed that Black people had the right to protect themselves when attacked, just like white Americans. Coming back to the movie, the pastor's offer to his son to become a preacher like him is based on the idea that only by being religious, subservient, and meek can Sammie and his community live peacefully. The problem is that racist people don't care if you're a good person. MLK was a pastor and a good person, and he was still killed. In a racist society, skin color alone is enough to make you a target. Pastor Moore has also internalized some racist ideas about Black culture. He sees the blues as the devil's music and urges his son to stop playing and follow a religious path. In this sense, Moore and Remick's promises are very similar. They both ask Sammie to renounce a part of himself in order to belong to a social group. If Sammie were to accept Remick's promise, he will have to disregard the African American past. Therefore, he will be engaging in the erasure of his history, culture, and the processes that shaped his identity. In the same way, if Sammie were to follow the path his father is setting for him, he would have to renounce the blues, a cultural expression rooted in traditions that precede slavery and that function as a form of resistance to oppression. Both choices represent false promises because a community based on acceptance will never ask someone to sacrifice a positive part of themselves in order to belong to it. This theme of the promise reflects the various, often limited, efforts at integration that African Americans have encountered throughout history, such as during Reconstruction, the Double V campaign, and the Civil Rights Movement. While all these movements brought significant social changes and legal progress, none succeeded in eradicating the systemic and social racism that African Americans continue to experience. In essence, the movie underscores that culture is a weapon against oppression. For this reason, the Lord's Prayer does not work against Remick, because Christianity was used to colonize the minds of the Irish, but also of the Africans who were uprooted from their lands to be enslaved in the Americas. In contrast, Annie's hoodoo mojo and supernatural knowledge help Smoke survive the attack, and Sammie weakens Remick when he hits him with the silver resonator of his guitar. Both Annie and Sammie use symbols of their culture to protect themselves. In blues novels like Song of Solomon and Corregidora, the blues is connected to cultural homecoming. This is because the blues carries cultural memory. It bears witness to the emotional and historical experiences of African Americans, including slavery, oppression, migration, and survival. Notice how the story begins with Smoke and Stack's literal return home to Mississippi and ends with Sammie becoming a blues musician, an act that conveys a symbolic return to his roots. In blues stories, reconnecting with the blues usually means reconnecting with family history, but also with collective struggle. This element in the movie is represented by the guitar. When the twins give Sammie the guitar, they tell him that it belonged to Charlie Patton, who is considered the father of the Delta blues. Later on, it is revealed that the guitar is a family heirloom. It belonged to the twins' father. This means that the guitar symbolizes both collective history through its associations with Patton and Sammie's family history. In this sense, Sammie becomes a bearer of African American cultural heritage. By resisting Remick's proposition, which obviously has cultural appropriation implications, Sammie protects his cultural heritage. Similarly, by rejecting his father's proposition, Sammie chooses to honor his African roots over a religion that was imposed on his people. The fact that Sammie's decision is driven by the night of horror at the juke joint reflects how the blues was born out of traumatic events and functions as an artistic form of coping with trauma while retelling what happened. If this movie has a message, is that cultural heritage is fundamental in resisting the oppression of the dominant culture. What I took from the ending is that the immortality of the artist is stronger than the immortality of the vampire. While Stack and Mary are forced to live in the shadows for an eternity, Sammie will eventually die, but his music will have immortalized his story and the African American collective experience. There are many more things I would like to say about this movie because it is definitely a masterclass in African American history. But unfortunately, this video will end up being 5 hours long. In addition, I think Coogler addresses all the issues that are left unanswered in Southern Gothic fiction. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please let me know in the comments how you like the movie. Take care. Bye.